Home, the late Republic, was a city of crowded ambition, a republic fraying at its edges, where men sought glory not only for the state, but for themselves. Beyond the Alps, a mosaic of tribes, the Helvetii on the move, the Belgic confederations, the tribes of the Atlantic coast, the Germanic Suebi, pressed against one another and against Roman interests. In such a world, a single commander could seize opportunity and bend it toward power. What followed in Gaul over a decade would be more than a string of battles. It would be a study in engineering, command and control, propaganda, and the uneasy alchemy of military triumph and political peril. It would lift one man from provincial command toward unrivaled influence, and it would leave in its wake cities burned, peoples displaced, and a map of Western Europe forever altered. If you want to follow every campaign and understand how each victory fed Caesar's rise, stay with the account to the end, subscribe, and enable notifications for the full series. Now let us begin with the first moves that set the continent alight: the migration of the Helvetii and Rome's response. When the Helvetii set out in 58 BCE, their movement was more than a migration. It was a rolling challenge to the order of the region. Their confederation, pressed by Germanic pressure and driven by ambition and necessity, prepared thousands of wagons and herds for an exodus that would carry them across the territory of tribes nominally allied with Rome. For Caesar, then proconsul in Transalpine Gaul, this could not be a mere matter of local rearrangement. A mass movement of peoples, testable in the heart of Gaul, threatened Roman allies, provoked unrest, and offered him the opening he needed: a casus to demonstrate Roman presence and to secure resources. Caesar's letters and subsequent narrative would frame his action as immediate and necessary. He wrote as though an onlooker might see the Helvetii as a migrating tide to be turned. Contemporary historians read those words and weigh them against motives more intimate to Roman life: debt, glory, the politics of patronage. Whatever his private motive, Caesar moved with the decisiveness of a commander who understood that military initiative confers political momentum. He intercepted the Helvetii at the pass of the Saône and then at the hill of Bibracte, forcing the tribes into battle on terrain the Romans could contest. On the morning of engagement, the sky was iron bright, and the smells of damp earth and pressed livestock clung to the air. The legionaries, hardened by service on the edge of empire, stood arrayed, with their pila ready, their standards snapping in a light wind. Centurions walked the ranks, eyes narrowing, touching shoulders, tilting helmets to catch the sun. Labienus, Caesar's trusted legate, rode along the line, a compact man, less inclined to rhetoric than to the precise orchestration of men in action.
"Keep the line," he said to a young centurion, and the centurion answered with a curt nod that made plain the simplicity of command beneath the grandeur of the moment. The Helvetii, many of them footmen pressed into the long march, lacked the discipline of the legion. Caesar himself took positions to outflank them, and the clash that followed was decisive. The Roman formation, with pila hurled to break the will of the enemy, and the steady advance of the legions, turned the migration into slaughter. Caesar later claimed vast numbers killed and many more captured. Ancient source figures are inflated by habit and rhetoric. Modern estimates, cautious and skeptical, suggest far fewer than the claims in the commentaries, though still enough to shatter the migratory drive. The effect, regardless of arithmetic, was to mark Rome's refusal to tolerate a great movement across Gaul without Roman assent. After the Helvetii, a greater test awaited on the eastern fringes. Ariovistus, king of a confederation of Suebi and allied tribes, had crossed the Rhine with warriors who called the open field their home and who fought with a ferocity tailored to the wooded, marshy lands of Germania. He had already established himself as a kingmaker among certain Gallic contingents, holding sway by the presence of armed horsemen and an aura of terrifying prowess. Caesar would not tolerate a Germanic potentate determining the fate of Gallic towns and Roman allies. War with Ariovistus required a different kind of campaign. Not only pitched battle, but persuasion of wavering Gallic allies, the drawing of diplomatic lines, and, at a crucial point, the precise use of cavalry to counter the Germanic shock. The encounter near the Vosges was, from the Roman perspective, a study in timing. Ariovistus had the advantage of numbers in cavalry and the advantage of familiarity with irregular warfare. Caesar arrayed his forces with an eye to preventing the Germans from deploying as they wished, using terrain and the steady discipline of the infantry to blunt the first shock. At the decisive moment, the Roman cavalry, disciplined and trained to charge in controlled wedges, struck the flanks of the Suebi. Ariovistus's forces, disordered and unable to regroup in the face of a coordinated Roman response, broke. Caesar's victory removed a Germanic king whose presence had threatened the balance in Gaul, and sent a message beyond the Rhine. Rome could project force and compel political settlement by arms. These early campaigns were not only demonstrations of battlefield superiority. They were demonstrations of Rome's capacity to marshal logistics at a scale unfamiliar to many of the tribes. The building of roads and the creation of fortified camps, castra, every night became part of the operational doctrine.
In winter or wet season, when supplies dwindled and the cold set teeth chattering, it was not bravery alone that kept the legions effective, but the discipline to build and maintain lines of communication, to forage with method, and to secure allies among fractious tribal elites like the Aedui and the Remi. When Rome turned its attention to the Belgae in 57 BCE, the scale of opposition multiplied. Caesar described the Belgae as the bravest of the Gauls, near enough to the Germans to have their customs and bellicosity. The Belgic Confederacy, fearing the growing weight of Roman power and certain that submission would mean loss of honor and wealth, threw itself into coalition. For Caesar, a swift and comprehensive campaign was necessary to avoid a prolonged, attritional war that might sap Roman resources and embolden opponents in Italy. The Romans moved with characteristic speed, conducting a series of rapid engagements that alternated between pitched battles and sieges. The campaign required careful management of supply trains and of the political theater. Offers of clemency for towns that submitted, exemplary punishment for those who resisted, and the forging of new alliances with tribes cautious of Belgic dominance. It was in this campaign that the Nervi, a tribe celebrated for ferocity and resolve, would test Roman steel most fiercely. The battle with the Nervi is remembered for the sheer suddenness of the assault and the discipline that saved the legions. The Nervi awaited in concealment, striking the Romans as they emerged from narrow defiles, and for a while the Roman lines staggered under the feral lunge. Shields clashed, and the sound of shouting men seemed to fill the air like a living beast. Within the chaos, it was not raw courage alone that turned the tide, but the presence of young officers and veteran centurions, men who could close gaps, form ad hoc reserves, and rally wavering cohorts.
Caesar rode among the men, not as a mere figurehead, but as a commander who cast himself into the hazard to steady morale. In the aftermath, Rome claimed a hard-won victory. Modern scholars note the intensity of the fighting and the heavy losses on both sides, cautioning that the total human cost cannot be measured solely by triumph. On the coast of the Atlantic, the Veneti presented a different problem. They were mariners whose livelihood and power derived from the sea. Their ships were sturdy, their ropes and rigging crafted for the Atlantic's tempests. When Caesar's agents interfered with their privateering, and when political rivalries pushed the Veneti into open defiance, Caesar faced a foe whose strength lay in an environment where Roman legions were less naturally dominant. The solution was not to be found in marching formations, but in adaptation. The campaign for the Veneti is a lesson in improvisation.
Caesar's ventures into Britain were not decisive conquests. They were incursions that demonstrated reach and probed for weaknesses, adding another layer to his continental dossier. It was during prolonged occupation and administration that the greatest danger to Rome's control in Gaul emerged. Not from a single tribe, but from the possibility of widespread coalition. The chains of allegiance Rome had woven through gifts, marriages, and promises of favor were worth less when the grievances of magnates and smallholders alike combined with the charisma of a new Gallic leader. Into that vacuum rose Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian of noble birth, whose name would come to stand in opposition to Caesar as no other leader had. Vercingetorix's ascent was swift and rooted in a different conception of warfare. Where many Gallic leaders fought as tribes and townships, Vercingetorix forged an alliance built on the idea of attrition, scorched earth, and guerrilla tactics. His strategy was to deny Rome the comforts and supplies that sustained long campaigns. Fields were burned, livestock driven away, towns stripped of their food. For the Romans, this was an existential challenge. The legions were formidable in battle and siegecraft, but they depended on forage and stores. A campaign without supplies is a march toward vulnerability, and Vercingetorix sought to make that vulnerability systematic. Caesar's response combined the patient application of siegecraft and the ruthless enforcement of Roman logistical superiority. Where Vercingetorix would withdraw to fortified hilltown after hilltown, destroying the corn that might feed a Roman army, Caesar would counter with circumvallations and a methodical approach. Surround, starve, and, when necessary, assault with engines and scaling ladders. It is here that the engineering genius Caesar prized and promoted found its fullest employment, not only in the rapid bridging of rivers or the cutting of enemy rigging, but in the vast concentric siege works that encircled places like Alesia. Before Alesia became the central contest, there were revolts that tested Roman resilience. Ambiorix and the Eburones, in 54 BCE, struck a reverberating blow. Ambiorix, using diplomacy and a flashing cruelty, tricked a Roman detachment into leaving a fortified camp and massacred them. Caesar had to accept the grim truth that occupation produced outrage and opportunity. Tribes would conspire, and winter quarters could become death traps. His response was swift, reasserting the pattern of punitive expeditions that restored Roman prestige at the cost of lives and villages.
He marched with what forces he could assemble to scour the areas of ambush and to make examples of those who had betrayed hospitality to Roman soldiers. Each punitive expedition had political reverberations. In Rome, the accumulation of victories furnished Caesar with the language of success, laurels to be translated into political capital.
But the laurels did not buy him anonymity. His ascent made enemies who feared a single man's command, men who had imagined themselves equals in the competitive aristocracy of Rome. Caesar needed money for his veterans and for the projects that would bind provincial elites to Roman structures. He needed fame to ensure his return to the center of power as more than a provincial general. Thus, every campaign served both strategic ends in Gaul and political ends in Rome, and the two could not be cleanly separated. When the campaign against the coastal tribes concluded and the Germanic threat had been checked, Caesar looked to conclude what he had begun, the breaking of the Arvernian coalition and the capture of Vercingetorix. Alesia would become the test of that resolve, a siege that would pit Roman technology and discipline against Gallic will and the hope of relief by allied tribes. The Romans at Alesia would construct rings of fortifications, both to contain the besieged and to resist the arriving relief forces. The works were elaborate. Double lines of ramparts, ditches, palisades, and towers organized to deny the Gallic horse and infantry any leverage. The day the siege began, soldiers heaved earth and placed stakes, their hands blistering, breath plumbing in the autumn air. The medley of human sounds, shovels striking stone, the barked commands of centurions, the creak of timber, filled the valley. To the besieged, the construction of the circumvallation must have seemed a slow strangulation. To the besiegers, it was a race against the clock and against the forces that promised to relieve the hill town. The arrival of those relief forces became a central motif in the drama of Alesia. Vercingetorix relied on unity among tribes. Caesar relied on the precision of entrenchment and the steadiness of men who had endured long campaigns. On the day when the relief army descended upon the Roman lines, battle unfolded on multiple fronts. One could stand at a vantage and see the two great bodies throw themselves at one another, the disciplined legions working to maintain positions on the circumvallation, sorties from the besieged trying to break the works, and cavalry charges seeking to exploit any opening. The Romans, trained to react in unison, moved reserves, adjusted fortifications, and launched countersorts. The relief army, buoyed by numbers and by the hope of freeing their compatriots, fought with a fierce urgency. Yet the Roman works held. Vercingetorix, recognizing that relief would not succeed and that his continuing resistance would only lead to greater slaughter, made the grim choice to surrender to Caesar, laying down weapons in a final, literal submission of arms before the man who had engineered his doom. What followed was not merely military, it was theatrical politics. Vercingetorix was led in chains to Rome years later, paraded in the triumph that declared Caesar's dominance.
The mopping-up campaigns of 5150 BCE would press the residual resistance and bind more territories into a Roman order. In the cities, Roman law and customs insinuated themselves. Municipal structures where local elites were incorporated. Roads that traced the veins of imperial logistics. Markets that soon knew Roman coin. These changes were incremental and often pragmatic, but they were cumulative and created a durable platform for Roman influence. Even as Caesar's star rose, the political theater in Rome convulsed. Men who feared his ambition argued for checks. Men who stood to gain from his patronage flocked to his banner. The victories in Gaul provided him with the weapons of rhetoric, triumph, wealth, and veterans who owed him more than a pension. Yet the Republic's institutions, fashioned in an earlier age, were not designed for single-man dominance. The tension between personal achievement and public rule, between provincial command and metropolitan governance, sharpened with each report that crossed the Alps. What finally would transform military success into political revolution was not a single battle, but the slow compression of advantage into opportunity. The Gaulish campaigns offered Caesar the means, legions loyal to him by shared hardship, a treasury swollen with booty and tribute, a narrative of necessity and rescue. They offered him also the stage upon which alliances could be recalibrated and rivals outmaneuvered. For Rome, the price of obedience to a successful commander was a gradual relinquishment of autonomy that only later would be seen as irreversible. The story of Caesar in Gaul is thus twofold. It is the story of a commander who used engineering, discipline, and boldness to make himself master of a continent's destiny. And it is the story of the human cost and political paradox of conquest. Tribes were broken and remade. Rivers were bridged. Ships were adapted. Siege works rose like a lattice of iron will upon the land. The men who followed Caesar did so for reasons as various as fear, hope, and fortune. Yet their deeds and their sacrifices would be woven into a narrative of triumph that carried within it the seeds of betrayal, the betrayal of a republic by the very instruments of its defense. At the close of a campaign season, as standards were struck and men tended wounds, cities were rebuilt and hostages returned to their families, the landscape of Gaul was altered beyond simple geography. Roman roads threaded through forests and marshes. Towns that had been centers of resistance were now nodes in a network governed by Roman law and habit. The political cost of such transformation was heavy. It shifted power to those willing to play the Roman game and away from traditional tribal authorities. For Caesar, the changes were successes to be cited and repeated. For many Gauls, they were losses measured in memory and in the erosion of customary life.
There remained, beyond these facts, the question that would haunt every decision thereafter. At what point does victory become ownership? And at what point does ownership demand more than any one man, however brilliant, should be granted? Caesar's campaigns in Gaul answered that question in force, if not in finality. They created an empire of influence and set the stage for the political struggles that would consume Rome. The century that followed would be shaped as much by the pattern he set, engineering mastery married to personal ambition, as by the raw outcomes of battles. We pause here at the turning of seasons, with the legions withdrawn into winter quarters, and with the campaigns poised to resume their long sweep toward definitive reckoning. The story of how Caesar's victories transformed into instruments of political dominance, how the loyalty of veterans and the yield of provincial treasuries redrew the map of Roman governance, and how alliances unmade in war were remade in the marble halls of power, continues with campaigns of attrition, diplomatic gambits, and the slow, inevitable slide towards civil conflict. The next seasons will bring further tests of endurance, culminating in events that will decide both Gaul's fate and Rome's future. Spring returned thin and restless to the camps. Men who had spent years under the eagle and the frost now polished weapons,
attended standards and listened for news as if the horizon itself might deliver a verdict. Caesar moved among them with the quiet authority of a commander who had learned to measure both storm and calm. He spoke of winters spent brooding over maps, of the value of a single road that linked a town to supply, of the need to maintain discipline lest habit slacken into indiscipline. Yet even as he planned the next season's operations in Gaul, another campaign was being waged, one of papers, speeches, and the shifting loyalties of men who took their oaths in the forum rather than on a spear point. Rome itself was fevered with argument. The death of Crassus and the breakdown of old compacts left a vacuum of influence that men with memory of past favors and fears of future reckoning sought to fill. Pompey, once the unchallenged champion of the Republic, stood at a crossroads. He had returned to the city to oversee land laws and veteran settlements. He had presided over triumphs that made his name both revered and dangerous. Some urged him to join openly with the Senate and the Optimates, trusting the old apparatus of magistrates and precedents to hold firm. Others counseled patience and reconciliation with Caesar, either by renewing his command in Gaul or by allowing him a path home without humiliation. The counsel he followed would mark him. Letters moved like currents between camp and capital.
Caia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Armies moved like currents between camp and capital. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. In Rome, many read these letters as proofs of arrogance. Others read them as the petitions of a man who had earned protection by service. The consuls and the Senate answered with a mix of legalism and suspicion, an order that Caesar laid down his command if he wished to stand for the consulship, a demand couched in the language of precedent yet carrying the weight of a trap. To lay down his imperium meant to be a private man in a city where private men were often powerless. To refuse meant to be a public enemy. The line between law and politics thinned. Senators invoked mos maiorum, the ancestral custom. Their rhetoric warned that no one man should be permitted the permanence of an army's loyalty. Tribunes tried to broker compromises. Cicero, who sought to preserve the republic's forms and had no love for Caesar's methods, nevertheless feared the dissolution of peace by violent means. His speeches betrayed a man pulled between the horror of a single-man rule and the horror of civil slaughter. For a time, there was hope that procedure might avert catastrophe, that Caesar would be allowed to stand for office without surrendering his legions, or that he would accept a safe and honorable withdrawal from power. But the momentum of suspicion had its own gravity. Pompey's choice was decisive not because it was clever, but because it was the only available path that seemed to answer the anxieties of Rome's senatorial elite. Pressed by senators who could not imagine a republic reconciled to Caesar's continuance of command, he accepted the mantle of defender of the Senate. He gathered its forces, called old friends to his side, and lent his prestige to the cause of resisting what many now openly called Caesar's ambition. The alliance thus formed was brittle. It contained men of conscience and men of interest, veterans who feared past debts and younger nobles who craved prominence.
It had no single steady purpose beyond the defense of a system under strain. Caesar watched this consolidation with a patience sharpened by campaign. He had made enemies by conquest. He had made friends by patronage and reward. Veterans who had bled under him believed in the man who fed them, led them, and shared their risks. Their loyalty was not simply personal, it was transactional and sacred in equal measure. To disarm without safeguards would be to betray those bonds. He sent envoys and offered alternatives. The Senate replied with orders and threats. The consulships prepared decrees that left him no good option. Either surrender command and stand for office as a private citizen, or keep his army and be charged with sedition. Winter broke into a cold, hard-edged spring.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era On. Winter broke into a cold, hard-edged spring. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. The threads of negotiation snapped one by one as suspicion mutated into resolve. The Optimates, having won Pompey's public alignment, moved to secure legal instruments that would make it impossible for Caesar to escape the consequences of refusal. They declared his legions forfeit the protection of law if he did not obey. Rome prepared to treat him as an outlaw if he crossed the threshold of his province with arms. For Caesar, the calculus was simple in its cruelty. Lay down the aegis that kept his men safe and expose them to vendettas and prosecutions, or carry the authority he had earned back to the city and demand redress on terms the Senate found intolerable. There are moments in history where a river is a border of more than water. The Rubicon, a narrow stream that marked the legal boundary between Caesar's province and Italy proper, became such a line. To cross it with a legion was to abandon the fiction that one was serving under the Republic's consent. It was to place an army shield between one's person and the judgment of magistrates. The decision was private and public, measured and immediate. Caesar called his officers together, spoke in the blunt language of necessity and the protection of his troops, and then gave the command that would unmake old arrangements and remake politics by force of arms. When the standards were shouldered and the cohorts moved, a silence settled. Not the fearful quiet of men who had never seen combat, but the concentrated hush of those who understood consequences. He stepped into the shallow water with the 13th Legion at his back. Whether he spoke the famous phrase ascribed to him, alea iacta est, matters less than the act itself. The die was cast. The march into Italy was swift and disciplined, not the chaotic surge the Senate had feared. Many communities opened their gates to him. They were disaffected by the Senate's policies, or they trusted the legions whose discipline ensured order, or they simply calculated that resistance would be ruin. Cities marred by corruption welcomed the promise of Caesar's reforms. Others, loyal to Pompey and the Senate, barred their gates. Rome, for its part, found its magistrates fleeing south to Brundisium and beyond, carrying with them the apparatus of authority, but not the authority itself. Pompey, declaring that he acted in defense of the Republic, collected his resources and withdrew, not into the prowling chaos of urban combat, but across the sea to muster a force in the Greek provinces, where support for his cause could be assembled among allies and client kings.
His retreat was strategic but also symbolic. He ceded the immediate moral high ground of the capital to one he called a usurper. For a while, the war promised to be a contest of reputation and resources rather than pitched battle. A contest of who could gather the greater coalition, who could win the hearts of Italian cities, who could secure the loyalty of governors.
Men whose fortunes had been bound to the old order feared their livelihoods. Those who had profited from Caesar's favor feared retribution. The machinery of patronage, so essential to Roman life, now operated as a weapon in a civil contest. When at last field met field in a pitched encounter, after maneuver, after winter campaigning, after the fortifying of positions, the outcomes would hinge on command, temperament, and a hard measure of luck. Veterans remembered the discipline instilled by Caesar. Pompey counted upon the larger numbers and the loyalty he had cultivated in different theaters. The years of campaigning in Gaul had sharpened one commander into a strategist of logistics and bold offense. They had also hardened Roman politics into a crucible where personal ambition and public good could not be neatly separated. The battles to come would decide not only which man held the reins of power, but what Rome would be thereafter. A republic made new by extraordinary men, or an empire born of a concentration of authority. For the moment, as the legions marched and the political centers reeled, the landscape itself bore witness. Roads laid in peace now echoed with martial tread. Towns that had been gaunt with neglect under factional rule found their lives reordered by occupation and edict. The Adriatic and the Mediterranean became stages for transport of troops and grain rather than only for trade. The transformation of Gaul that Caesar had begun, roads, colonies, Roman municipal life, was mirrored in Italy by the movement of men and the rearrangement of civic priorities. What had been an external project of domination became at once a domestic reordering. And still the question hovered. Once conquest and administration had been used to secure personal advantage, could the old forms ever be fully restored? The answer would not be given by chambers and decrees alone, but by camps and cohorts, by sieges and sallies, by the courage of individuals and the endurance of institutions. As spring ripened into summer, the scene was set for a clash that would determine whether Rome's destiny would be republican in manner or imperial in practice. Caesar rode toward that collision with the same mixture of calculation and impulse that had carried him through Gaul. His enemies arrayed themselves with resources of their own, and the Republic, if it still was such, waited with a fate that seemed now less a possibility than a consequence of choices already made. In a field town outside one of the cities that had chosen his standard, Caesar paused to read a report brought by a courier. Pompey had raised forces in Greece. Several Italian towns had declared for the Senate. Some prominent senators had left Rome. The paper trembled in his hands, not from doubt, but from the awareness of the moment's gravity. He looked out at the camps, at the men who had crossed borders with him, who now expected him to deliver security and reward, and understood that the next moves would be the proofs of a general and the determinations of a ruler. He smiled, not a triumphal smile, but the calm smile of a man who prefers action to words, and gave the order to march. The standards rose. The drums began their measured beat. The road unrolled ahead like a promise that had to be kept. The march toward Greece and toward the deeper reckonings with Pompey's power had begun. The culmination, battles that would decide the fates of provinces, cities, and the Republic itself, loomed, and every mile of road would be measured in consequence. He gave the order, and the columns broke into motion as at a single will. Wagons clattered. Engineers and muleteers hastened to adjust loads and cut fresh slack for the lines of march. Couriers sped ahead to secure billets in towns that had declared for him. Foragers, under strict guard, took only what necessity allowed. For Caesar knew that a victorious army must not become a hated one by needless pillage. Where roads narrowed, the standards closed ranks. Where country opened to plain, the cohorts uncoiled and took their measured stride. Officers moved with crisp economy. A man of action cannot be preoccupied with pomp. Word reached him in the evening that the fleet had been spotted preparing at Brundisium. Pompey, it seemed, would cross the sea with haste and gather his strength in Greece. That information sharpened the contours of choice. To shadow Pompey, to cut his communications, to intercept his transports, or to cross the Adriatic first and seize the interior before Pompey could entrench. Each option carried hazard. The sea belonged not to the swiftest, but to the well-prepared. The loyalty of towns might falter if neither side offered security. Caesar listened, weighed, and then gave the commands that suited a commander who preferred to force events rather than wait for them. The legions were readied for embarkation with the same methodical speed that marked their campaigning. Piles of shields and spear shafts stacked with latterwork care, cooks stowing kettles, centurions inspecting harnesses as if each buckle could decide a battle. Antony and other officers directed the loading, not in haste, but with intent. For Rome's fortunes would be carried as surely in these small, swaying holds as upon the outcomes of pitched combat. Men joked to stave off the perilous stillness. Others sat silent, hands on their hilt, eyes fixed upon the sea, as if the horizon could tell them which fate awaited. When at last the flotilla was ready, it slipped from the shore like a living thing. Sails loomed white against the dusk. Oars rose and fell in matched cadence. The scent of tar and wet rope mixed with the metallic tang of coin and steel. Caesar stood upon the quarter-deck of the vessel that carried his standard. He did not speak of fate, only of duty. Around him, those officers kept their distance, not so much out of reverence as out of recognition. He bore not a tyrant's isolation, but the burden of command. Men saw in his face neither the blaze of triumph, nor the tremor of fear, but a composure that steadied them as the hulls creaked and the sea took them. The crossing itself was taut and swift. Bad weather might have scattered these same ships and changed history by a gale or a sudden squall. Yet the winds were patient that night, and a thin moon painted the sea with a band of silver. Below deck, men lay awake and listened to the long monotony of oars. They spoke in low voices of wives and fields, of promotions hoped for, of the rumors that had sent them from camp to camp. Others prayed, quietly, to gods whose temper they could not foretell. Above, on deck, Caesar traced with his gaze the opposite shore as it grew nearer, a line of dark hills, a scatter of lights where villages kept their lamps, and, beyond them, the possibility of meeting that would either confirm his daring
or undo him. They made landfall in the shadow of a promontory, where the coast gave way to scrub and stone. Scouts slipped ahead and returned with tidings that left little to romantic exaggeration. Pompey's banners did not yet dominate the plain, but his forces occupied the commanding heights. His fleets watched the harbors as eagles watch a carcass. Pompey himself had not yet gathered the entirety of his men, but his legates, men of wealth and standing, had pressed the allied cities to his side. Mercenaries and provincial levies filled the encampments on the ridges. It was, in sum, the posture of a man who would not lightly risk all he had amassed, a posture that invited maneuver rather than headlong clashing. Caesar read these signs as one reads the face of a chess opponent who hopes by patience and numbers to overturn a bold move. He did not disdain caution. He measured it against the force of his own army's spirit. That spirit, honed through years in foreign lands, tempered by wear and hunger and victory, was not to be underestimated. He sent envoys with terms that might yet end the contest, men who carried, beneath the formal speech, an unspoken truth. Much depends upon choice. Pompey's answer would come by messenger and by drum, in parley and in skirmish. Night found the two camps set like stones upon the land. Tents flamed with oil lamps. Watchfires burned to keep the men from sinking into the dangerous sleep of complacency. Caesar walked among his soldiers, listening to their small talk, taking measure of their quiet, promising rewards not in rhetoric, but in the hope of lands and ranks. He watched a centurion return, hand bandaged, who would smile when Caesar asked him of him, straightening the strap upon his helmet as if that act were itself an answer to fate. Orders were whispered, scouts were sent, and the generals conferred beneath maps spread upon a table.